Commissioner Novara, welcome to the show. How are we doing today?
Thanks, Tom. Doing well.
We are excited to have you. So we have a lot to cover, but let's start at square one. For our listeners who might not be familiar with the Chicago Department of Housing, can you just give the 101? What is the Department of Housing? What is the mission? And talk to us how it's evolved and how it's gotten to its a present day status.
Sure. Yeah. Let me start with kind of a general benchmark, which is that housing is affordable to you if you're paying no more than 30% of your income toward where you live. And some people can't reach that 30% benchmark because either the rent's too high or their income is too low or both. And that's where government often steps in to try to help and bring rents down to a level that people can pay a healthy portion of their income, or 30% or less, as opposed to 50 or 60% of their income, because when that's the case, we know that other things are going to go awry in their lives. And so what we do as a department is we provide the resources to provide housing that people can afford through rental housing, through home ownership, through supporting neighborhood-based organizations that help people become homeowners, that help people avoid foreclosure, that help people with all manner of things related to their housing. And our mission is to provide the resources that people need. And our vision really is the equitable distribution of affordable housing across all 77 community areas. I think a really fundamental belief for me in this role is that if you need a subsidy to live affordably, I want you to have just as many choices about where to live as someone who doesn't need a subsidy to live affordably. Right now in Chicago, I'd say we're a long way from that vision, but our goal every day is to get us closer to that.
Got it. And so is this a relatively new department? Is this something, what was the impetus of, hey, we need this. This is a huge need in the city. We have to have a department focused on this.
So this is a case of what's old is new again. When I was developing affordable housing in the first decade of the century, there was a separate Department of Housing and a separate Department of Planning. And after the foreclosure crisis in 2008, they were merged into a variety of names of departments, eventually settling back on Department of Planning, of which housing was a bureau. And that was the case for much of the 2010s. And then starting in 2019, it was reconstituted again as its own standalone department. So at the point that Mayor Lightfoot appointed me as commissioner in June 2019, it had been a decade since there had been a housing commissioner as such.
Got it. So you were the first one to boomerang this thing back then.
Correct. Yes.
All right. That's nice. You get to establish the baseline.
Yes. And, what's been interesting is I certainly came into the role with my own long to-do list of things that I thought we needed to be doing. And no surprise, it turned out that lots of other people had a long to-do list for me as well, that they had been sort of saving up over 10 years when there had not been a commissioner to really push in the same way.
Great. So we're going to talk about, because you guys have accomplished a lot, but before even going there, before you were appointed commissioner, I want to tie back to some of the work you did before that. Just bring to the forefront the lack of affordable housing here in Chicago. So I know I believe it was 2016, 2017, somewhere around that time, you did a study on segregation, and It also discussed Chicago's roadmap for racial equality. And I think our listeners who play in a lot of these different pockets in Chicago would love to hear about this. So can you give us the background on that study? Just the 2-minute, what you guys discovered, why it's important, and how does that tie into some of the work that you are doing today?
I'd be happy to. And I'll just back up one moment from your question, which is, prior to that, I mentioned I was doing affordable housing development in North Lawndale on the west side. And I did that work for many years in many different ways. So some of that was rehabbing 2 and 3 flat graystones. Some of it was low-income housing tax credit, new construction development, and some of, so a range of different ways of using affordable housing tools in that community that, the range of your listeners might be familiar with. that really informed my perspective when I went from there to the Metropolitan Planning Council, and I was working on policy issues and a lot of affordable housing policy issues. And the last time that the city decided to take a look at the Affordable Requirements Ordinance, or the ARO, was in 2015, prior to the one we just did in 2021. And as part of that, I remember really clearly one of those like luncheons that you go to where they were discussing the changes they were contemplating, and everything that we were suggesting we take a look at, like, hey, this is our one tool. The ARO is our one tool to help us get at how segregated we are as a city. What would it take for the city to change its requirements in this way? And the answer was often, that would be too expensive. Okay, well, what would it take if developers changed their process in this way? Well, that would be too expensive. And what it really triggered for me was a question, which was, I think our status quo of living so profoundly separately by income and by race is quite expensive, but I don't have a way to prove that or talk about that. And I wonder if there is a way to talk about that. Is there an economic argument to be made on this topic? And that really sparked that question. I found a research partner, and ultimately we found that the answer is yes, there are pretty massive and profound costs to how separately we live by race and income. What we found was, if we as a region were to lower to the median amount of segregation, just if you look at the 100 top metros in the country, if we were to lower to the median instead of being in the top 10, I'm not even saying drop us to the bottom or the best ever, simply just middle of the road, right? We would see an increase in $4.4 billion in African-American income, which translates to an $8 billion gain in the region's GDP. We would see 30% less homicides, and we'd see 83,000 more bachelor's degrees in the Chicago region. So what we were trying to do with these findings was to say that the way we're set up as a city has an economic impact on all of us, and therefore we are all need to be part of the solution.
There's a lot there. Mark, go ahead. I know you're chomping to get in here.
Well, I just want to be clear for the listeners. When we're talking about segregation, we're just talking about what we all know to be, we have Puerto Ricans that live in this neighborhood, white people that live in this neighborhood, African, like that's what we're specifically talking about here in the study, correct?
Yeah, we're talking about racial and economic segregation, right? Which can be very different things. In Chicago, the two are very tied together, right?
Okay.
So our lowest income areas tend to be Black and brown. Our highest income areas tend to be white. And so it's easy to conflate the two topics, but really we did pull them apart and look at them separately by race, racial segregation, and by income segregation.
Thank you for clarifying that. On another curiosity note, are there cities, I mean, we, even living here, we all kind of know that I don't think we ever understand the financial impact that you're about to really break down for us, but are there other cities that are more segregated than Chicago? And just curious.
Are we the worst?
Yeah, I always thought we would be the worst.
There's a lot of different ways to measure that. So it partly depends if you're talking city versus metro region, then the rankings change. Our study was done by metro region. If you go by city, sometimes Milwaukee is worse than Chicago. We're usually if you go by city, we're definitely in the top 5 and sometimes the top 3, but we're usually not the worst, actually.
So a lot of work goes into this, but can you just give us a little bit behind the scenes? Like, how did you actually do this work? How, like, to come up with these numbers of if this, then that? How? It just seems like such a complicated question, right?
You found a research partner. Like, how did you find that person? Like, we love the nuts and bolts on this podcast of kind of how.
Yeah, go ahead and get a little tactical here. Let's behind the scenes, if you don't mind sharing.
Because there's a lot of work you probably put into that, so we also want to show that how hard this was for you.
Yeah, it's interesting you ask about that, because part of the work was coming to an answer, and then part of the work was translating it in a way that people could understand, because we were working with PhD researchers at the Urban Institute. So we reached out to the Urban Institute, which is based in DC, and said, here's a question we have. Has anyone else answered this question? Do we just not know that there is already an answer? And they dug around and said, no, actually, this would be the first time we would be trying to quantify this and figure it out. So they were intrigued for the same reason. And we had a team of researchers that worked with us on this question. And then we here locally in Chicago had a team of advisors that was advising the work and pushing and prodding us in different ways as we were getting some of the data back. And what was interesting is that as we started to get some of the data back, one of the ways I remember this conversation really clearly, that where our team at Urban Institute said something along the lines of, well, I mean, it's really like one standard deviation away from XYZ. And I was like, guys, that's not a thing that we can say. So we're going to need to figure out some other ways of conceptualizing this for people. And that's where we got to the median measure, right? Where we said, okay, people can basically understand that we're looking at the top 100 metros in terms of size and, population, and we're ranking them based on economic and racial segregation. And we are saying, if Chicago were to drop to the median, what would we expect based on what we see in those metro regions, based on the outcomes we see in those metro regions? What could we expect to see? And that became the way we conceptualized it so that people could absorb it and wrap their arms around this information.
And how long did this take? Like, this is years? Is this, this just seems like a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it took about, I think, over a year. I mean, it took a while to get it funded. So we had to get it, get the work funded first, form this group of advisors. Then they did, the first round of analysis. And then we picked and poked at it and said, okay, we need to do some new things to get at new things we hadn't thought about yet, and so on. So it took over a year to do that. And I will say, there's, when you take on something like this, the fundamental anxiety about that is that you don't know what you're going to find at the end, right? It could be that, no, actually, it turns out it does benefit white, wealthy people perfectly well to stay just the way you are. Well, guess what? I'm not interested in trumpeting those findings if that's the result we get, because I'd really like to use this information to help us come up with a shared sense of needing to move in a different direction. But you can't script that. You have to just go with it and see what you find. And that's hard for a lot of people. It's not always easy for a board of directors. It's not always easy for staff to kind of set out on a process of inquiry and not be entirely sure what you're going to find at the end of it.
Well, I think it's really cool. And you had to, for a moment, thought it was cool, and then maybe got scared, like you were just saying. But you went to the Urban Institute, big research on a national level, and you brought a question that no one's even asked or thought of. Like, you had to oh my gosh, I'm onto something big here, or, oh no, what am I onto? Like, that had to be like a cool and scary moment for you right there.
Yes, I think there was a very, very long period where it was unclear what this process was going to yield. And so the ability to just sort of sit with that unknown for a long time was a thing.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
So this is what we find in the study. Did you have recommendations moving forward? Like, hey, these are some steps Chicago can take to get moving in the right direction that you've now implemented as commissioner. But what were some of those, I guess, recommendations?
Well, can we take one more step backwards? So, you threw out, I jotted a couple of them down, like these big numbers and percentages. Yeah. Like, how are those determined? Like, how can you dig a little into more of the numbers or the findings, I guess, before we talk about your solutions?
Yeah. So they did. They ran and back in 2017, I could have answered this a little bit more authoritatively, but many years have passed now. They did a bunch of very advanced analyses and could say with a 90% confidence interval that this is the outcome we could expect to see, because metro regions at the median are experiencing these levels of income, homicides, and bachelor's degrees. Now, the things that didn't hit, because we tested for a lot of things, right? And the things that didn't hit showed that maybe if we changed in that way, it wouldn't make a big difference on life expectancy, let's say, or some of the other measures that we looked at and tried to study. So what we came out with were the things that we did show a big difference on. And what we also showed was that if we continue on as a region on our current path a very slowly, because, it's important to note, we, white Chicagoans back in 1916 in the start of the Great Migration, made some very clear decisions, right? To say when Black Southerners began to migrate north, to say, here's where you can live and here's where you can't live. And we will now enforce that for decades, right? Those were decisions that were made. Now, 100 years later, most folks are not actively reinforcing those decisions in the way that they were through legal means and violent means, 100 years ago, but the results remain. And so it was getting sort of marginally better. But what we did do was to map out, look, if we continue on this path, we would not become a substantially less segregated region until I think it was like 60 years from now or something. And so let's look this in the face. Are we really willing to forego 83,000 bachelor's degrees, 30% more homicides, leave 4 billion on the table, or 8 billion as a region? Are we really willing to forego that? Or are we willing to do some things differently? That was really the question we were putting out there. So to your question, Tom, we divided it into two efforts. So the first effort was to find, is there a cost? And if so, here's what it is. The second effort was, what do we do about it? And I actually found that one to be much more difficult of a process. That took another year. And we had about 100 advisors that time. And we spent a bunch of time on the question of, if you wanted to do something substantial about the issue of racial and economic segregation, what would you be doing differently? And it was a super just fascinating and really important process for me as a person and as a leader and all of this, because I think that an assumption one might make, if you come out saying, here's all these negatives about segregation, well, then you might be assuming that the answer is to say, how do we become super integrated as a city and as a region? And what we learned in the process was that integration is not the end goal. And the end goal really is racial equity. And I can say more about that if you want me to dig into kind of the difference between the two in our minds.
Let's go there. So
okay.
Difference between integration and racial equality.
Racial equity. Yeah. Sorry. So what I had a conversation with a woman on our board at the time, who was a Latina woman. And she, as we were talking, she said, I just want to step back a minute and question, are you saying that integration is the goal? And I said, well, we're not saying that. We're trying to figure out exactly what we are saying. She said, because I want to push you on this. When I hear the word integration, I hear winners and losers, and the winners never look like me. And it was one of those moments that just very much like a record scratch of like, okay, so I think we need to reframe this as, if you think about it, Tom, think about like schools that are racially mixed, but they don't have equitable outcomes, or even a town that might be diverse, but who ends up getting arrested the most, pulled over the most, any number of things, right? You can have a diverse space. That doesn't mean the outcomes are equitable for people. So if the goal needs to be equity by race and by income, not just that their people are mixed together in the same space. It's two different things, right? So let's be really specific about what we mean. And if in fact people, and I also want to say this part really clearly, any of this work that we were doing is not to say that there's something wrong with majority Black or majority brown spaces, or that people in those spaces should want to move and get out of those neighborhoods. It is to say that it's easier and more efficient to discriminate against people of color when you can draw a line around them and say, I'm going to give predatory loans to everyone in this neighborhood, right? Which is how it shows up today. And so that's one. And number two is, I just want people to have choices. If your best choice for you and your household is to stay right where you are and move up the economic ladder where you are, then let's make sure we're giving you good options to do that. And if you're someone who finds, I'd actually really like to move because my job is now somewhere else, because my kid got into a school somewhere that I want to be closer to, any number of things, I want to make sure you have the option to do that if that's the best thing for your household. So that led us to to answer number two, which was what do we do about it? Essentially, we work to become a more racially equitable region. So one pillar of that was to say, here's ways that government, private sector, NGOs can embrace a racial equity framework, which basically means I'm going to examine all my outcomes by race and other ways you can marginalize folks. And if they're not equitable, I got to fix it. And then we had a bunch of pillars. We had education, we had economic development, and of course we had a housing pillar, which given my background, I was the lead on. And that was where we laid out a bunch of very specific things to do to achieve racial equity in housing. And that's what we then briefed the candidates for mayor on, because that came out in 2018 and we were gearing up to a big mayoral election.
Lot there.
Yeah.
So we put all this work in it. Is this been well received? Right. I know it's not easy. I know there's a million layers and we're a huge city, but do you feel the work has been, do you feel people are listening?
I will say it was a notable change that when we briefed the then candidate Lightfoot on this report, her response to it was to say, this is essentially my platform. This is how I want to approach the job. And later, when she was elected and was mayor-elect, the conversation that she and I had was, will you come enact the things in this report? This is how I want to do it. Come do it. Which made it very hard to say no to, because these are all things that, you know, I really believed in and really wanted to see the city do. And we here had somebody saying, I'm going to open the door and ask you to come in and go do them. And she has very much supported me in approaching the work this way.
I'm always taking it a step back here. So you have such a passion. It's very obvious when you talk about all of this, and we haven't even dug into most of it yet, but where does this passion come from? Like, where in your past, like, I mean, you did some 2 flats and 3 flats and you may work that, but where does the true passion come from in your life for this cause?
Oh, that's a good question, Mark. I ended up when I was in grad school and I ended up in North Lawndale as in an internship. And I was working at the time, it was a welfare to work program. And I was working with the women in that program on sort of stabilizing the rest of their life outside. You know, in order to go from not working to working 40 hours a week, there's a whole bunch of things that need to get taken care of that maybe you were patching up, you know, during all that time and holding things together. One of them was the women's housing. It was very unstable. Lots and lots of concerns. And one day I had a woman who, she had 7 children and her youngest had been told he had lead poisoning due to lead paint in their apartment. So she was given a letter from their doctor saying, you have to find a new place to live or your children will be removed from you. So very high stakes. You've got to change things right away. And she and I spent the day driving around the West Side, trying to find a place that could house her and her 7 kids. Not easy. And we ended up in one place in particular that she filled out all the paperwork and we turn it back in and the woman behind the desk says, thanks, that'll be a 15 to 20 year wait. And it was a moment for me. We went back and just sat there in silence. Like, what? First of all, I felt personally incredibly useless in this moment. Like, what am I doing? I am not helping this person in one bit. Maybe 15 years from now, what does that do, right? And 2, it was really for me the beginning of thinking about housing that people can afford that is safe and quality as a justice issue. It is not a nice to have, it is a necessity in people's lives. And the unfortunate thing is, as a country, we don't approach it that way. We don't treat housing you can afford as an entitlement. And so as a result, only 1 in 4 people who qualify for a subsidy to live affordably actually get it. So of course, that means as a city, we're not going to be able to house everyone who needs it. But what I can do in this role is to try to move the needle as very far as I possibly can in the moment that we have and the council that I have and the money that we have to get as close to seeing justice done on this issue as possible.
That's awesome. Sorry, I wanted to just make sure I highlight the passion before we keep going.
No, it's good stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the ARO, because you mentioned it at the beginning and you mentioned the updates that have happened in, call it 2020, 2021 timeframe.
Yep.
For our listeners who don't know, I'll just the 30-second background. The ARO is the Affordable Requirements Ordinance. And you can go ahead and correct me, but my layman understanding of it is, if you get any sort of entitlement from the city, so basically a zoning change, if you're going to do a big development and change zoning from X to Y, and you get approved for that, you then are responsible to provide X amount, usually I believe 20% of the units need to meet an affordable metric. Affordable meaning they take the median income of that area, they put some factor on it to make it so that they do some calculation to say, yep, even though these things would rent for $1,800, like 20% of them have to be at $1,100 or whatever that number is, right? Which is a very good theory and a very good way to do this. We have developers who listen to this show that say, hey, that sounds great. I'd love to do it. My numbers don't work then, right? And there's that push and pull between developers trying to get things done and the city trying to do the right thing. And it's hard to thread that needle and make it all work. So can you, from someone who's, I don't want to say the other side because we're in this together, but from someone with a different perspective to those developers who are saying like, hey, like we can't make this work. This ARO is killing the deal. What are some things that you would say to say, no, like these are ways we can look at this together?
I appreciate the question because it was the biggest topic because I was part of the mayor's transition team and we had a whole housing advisory team that was, among many advisory groups during her transition. For the housing transition team, the single biggest topic that people brought up was the ARO and the need to strengthen it actually which I think by the definition of those writing in meant get more affordable housing out of it than it had gotten to that point. So we knew this was something that we wanted to address and we set up a task force pretty early on. We thought it would take 9 months and then of course COVID happened. So it ended up taking more like 18 months because lots of folks were focused on lots of other things for a while. But ultimately, I'll just say a word about some of the changes that we made because it gets back to what's your vision for the city, right? The ARO is fundamentally our chief desegregation tool that we have because it is focused on areas that would otherwise be able to support a 100% market rate deal. You don't need a subsidy to make this deal work, right? The way some neighborhoods, the market rents are so low that you have to have a subsidy to make the deal pencil. If we're talking about the West Loop, you're good all day long, except you need a zoning change and now you need something. And now the city can say, in exchange, I need some affordable housing in this development. But what we had seen to that point was that developers were only required to build a small portion of those required units on site, and they could write a check for the rest of the money, which in theory is not a bad thing because we would use that money to fund affordable housing all over the city. I mean, it's not that it didn't get used for affordable housing, but if you are saying we have a fundamental problem as a city that people don't have choices, they have lots of choices in some parts of the city and next to none in other parts of the city. Well, then you would say, well, how could I change this tool so that people could have more choices? And so one of the things we did was we gave more flexibility so that if you're building the units on site, that can actually be in a whole range of neighborhoods that we would consider fairly high income and lacking affordable housing. So you don't have to put them all in the West Loop. You could put some on the Northwest side, for instance, and that would be just fine by us because we are trying, again, to give people more options across parts of the city where they don't have options now. So yes, anytime you try to do something like that, what you will hear in equal measures is a group of people telling us this doesn't go nearly far enough. You're letting developers get away with murder. We need way more affordable housing. And then I'll have folks saying, this is going way too far. You're going to kill development. What on earth are you doing? Right. And
it's even harder than that because sorry to interrupt, but you also then have living in Jefferson Park. We witnessed this. People don't understand what affordable housing is. Right. There's a development that went up here and the neighborhood was up in arms about like, oh, we're letting the riffraff in. And it's like, Jesus, like the not in my backyard people as well. Like, so then you have the third person pulling against you as well. Like you have three people to a piece here, or three different groups.
Welcome to my job. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good time. So the other thing that we did at the same time that we were contemplating these changes, because we did increase it to 20% across the board. Previously, it had been a whole complicated mix of, sometimes it was 15%, sometimes it was 20. You only had to do 25% actually built, et cetera. So we basically upped it to 20% across the board. But what we did at the same time was that we worked with a bunch of our partners and legislators statewide and helped to pass a statewide law that provides a tax abatement if you put 20% affordable units on site. So we were very purposeful about that being something that helped allow the higher standards we wanted to make them financially feasible. And Cranes just ran a piece saying, essentially it was like, after years of grumbling, developers acknowledge that this works. And a lot having to do with the state tax abatement that allows them to offset that a bit. But that was something we were very purposeful about doing in tandem.
Got it. In moving forward, do you see this getting easier to tie the two sides together, to put that on developers to provide that affordable housing? Or do you feel the walls are coming down a little bit and these types of deals are becoming more and more relevant?
I think so. I just met with a couple new alders, some that were, appointed mid-term or and so on. And in some cases, I pointed them to some alders who have a long track record of working with developers to get this done and to get units on site because they value it. I think there is some wisdom in some folks in council who work closely with us to get it done. And then in cases where, like you mentioned, in your neighborhood where it was more of a challenge, I think that's where we really have to double down on the point I made earlier to Mark, which is in the development, there was a development near O'Hare that was a market rate deal, but 20% affordable. That's 59 units on site of a building just 2 stops from O'Hare, right? So huge access to jobs and so on. So 59 units of affordable housing is the size of a whole deal that I would have to subsidize from start to finish normally. This is a huge amount, right? Yep. And in this case, and I do not have the resources to do that everywhere that it's needed. So for us, that the developer was willing to do this, that the developer could make the numbers work with the tax abatement, and we could get that done without public money is a huge win. Because again, I can't pay for enough to meet the need.
Yeah. No, that's great. So, all right. So, Mark, do you have anything else on ARO? Otherwise, I'm going to switch to another acronym now.
Oh, let's go to ADU.
Let's go to ADU. Let's acronym it up here.
Yeah.
So we had a nice, our little brief call that we had. One of the things that I learned from you that the ADU, so the additional dwelling unit ordinance that recently passed, was originally intended for the entire city. Is that correct? Because that's one of the biggest complaints we get from, when we talk to listeners, when we go to meetups is, I'm 4 blocks over. Why can't I take advantage of this? But the guy 4 blocks to the west, east, whatever can. Like these lines make no sense.
Right. Yeah. If you look back at what we introduced, it was a citywide ordinance. We later came back with 5 pilot areas, and that is a reflection of the council support that we had. And so we have heard lots and lots of interest from members of council in making this citywide. And so I do think it's something that we'd like to return to as things change and we have, a very different council coming up. I think it's something we definitely want to revisit. And I think it's important to note that there's some differences in the pilots by geography that we may need to continue. And here's an example I'll give of that. We heard from an alderman on the south side who said, I already struggle with investors buying buildings that before an actual owner occupant gets a chance to buy it and live there. And I want less investors and I want more owner occupants. And I fear that if this passes in my ward, it only becomes more profitable for an investor to buy this property and rent out yet another unit. And I don't want to make that any more profitable than it already is, because I'm trying to get more owner occupants. So given that concern, what we did was that in some of the pilot areas, if you're under a certain number of units, I think it's 3 units, then you have to, the building has to be owner occupied in order to take advantage of it. And that's not the case in other parts of the city where alders are more concerned just with, meeting some of the demand for housing that's over the top, and they're not as concerned about that. And so I think there's a lot of room for us to be sensitive to the context in which this is occurring, but we have some really interesting data. I mean, so far, about 2/3 of our applications have been for owner occupied properties. So the notion that this would sort of be like a investor bonanza is not exactly playing out that way. And those were some of the concerns that we heard.
I think I'll speak from what me and Tom hear all the time, and what I think from my opinion as well too. I think this has been a huge conversation point, and it actually triggers more owner occupied people to do what we call house hacking, where you live in one and rent the other as like a stepping stone. They might become an investor 10 years down the road, but that actually creates so much more inventory or opportunity for people to do it. If anything, it creates a whole nother investment strategy in the city of Chicago, whether it be owner occupied or investors, because they now become quote unquote specialists in be able to take a 3-flat with a non-conforming garden and convert it. Like that becomes a whole nother segment of opportunity. So I think it would be huge everywhere. And there's a couple of Southside aldermen that I've talked to that have shared similar feedback, what you said. And what I always tell them is it's going to be your investors that are going to come in and do the heavy lifting. Because here's the thing, your building that needs $120,000 worth of work, your owner occupied person is going to come in and do it half-ass. Or they're not going to do it, or they're going to put in a contract that it's going to fall apart. And it's your investors that'll come and do the heavy lifting, hold it for 3 to 5 years, and then sell it when they're off to do something else. And it's going to go to an owner occupied person with 20 years left on all that CapEx improvements that investor did. So there's definitely a spin on it for those aldermen that they have to kind of look at this long term.
Yeah. One more thing to add there too is it took financing a little bit to come around to this. I remember we had Perry on, I can't remember what episode, but we had homeowners coming on or just having the conversation saying, I can't get a construction loan for that 3rd unit because it's not approved yet. There's this whole chicken and the egg thing of getting those construction rehabs. So you needed a homeowner who had liquidity to get it done. And then finally, some of the banks started catching up and revising their programs on it too. Yes.
And I think you raise a really important point, Tom, because part of, we have seen way more requests and then approved applications on the north and northwest side zones than we have in the other, in the south, the west, and the southeast pilot zones. And a big part of that, of course, not surprising, is that when you have owners with disposable income, they can charge ahead and do this. When you have people who are more constrained, then they're waiting for their lender to catch up and get comfortable with it, or they're waiting. We did put together some grant assistance actually for lower income homeowners so that this wouldn't be an absolute barrier. But I think we knew going in that we would see more uptake in parts of the city where we've got owners with more disposable income for that exact reason. And it's part of the reason we think we've got to double down our efforts in making sure folks in other parts of the city are aware of the resources they can access so that they can take advantage of this too.
No, it's good stuff. So we have covered a ton here, but I'd like you to highlight, over the past 2-3 years, maybe give us that 1 or 2 accomplishment that you want our listeners to know that, your department is either working on or has accomplished, because I feel like it's almost behind the scenes. Like we don't really hear about it until something's passed and it's like, oh, great, cool. Let's read up on this. And I kind of know it. And I Googled it for 30 seconds. Right. Like, give us a little bit behind the scenes of some of the other work that's being done here. Because you have a huge department with a bunch of talented people. Showcase that. Like, this is your time to tell us what's going on behind the scenes.
Well, a couple of things that we haven't talked about that we're in front of the scenes, but that we haven't talked about. So let me cover that first. One is that last year we announced the largest funding round ever in the city so $1 billion across 24 developments all over the city. And for the first time, we had non-federal, most of the time we're funding our developments with low-income housing tax credits, home, CDBG, and TIF. That's it, right? For the first time, the city issued a bond, an economic development bond that we are now using to make that amount of production possible. So I think that's a real innovation that is, especially in this moment when we're seeing, interest rates through the roof, we're seeing 30% rise in construction costs. These dollars are what's helping us get to the finish line on our closings, because otherwise we got people coming to the table with massive gaps, that otherwise would hold them up. So that's been one. I'm super excited that we were able to get that amount of housing funded. And it's not just the sheer number, it's also the way that we did it. So I talked to you earlier about an emphasis on racial equity. We actually did the first ever in the country racial equity impact assessment of our own low-income housing tax credit program. We said, how are we doing? Let's look at our own data and critique ourselves, and then kind of tweak accordingly based on what we find. And so we did that, and we found a lot of things that we needed to do better. And we were very clear about that and continue to do so. So we're now this coming year, 2023 will be our next funding round. And we continue to kind of adjust and look at our data and see what we need to do differently. So that's exciting. We, with the Department of Planning, made a request for proposals for LaSalle Street. And, I think that's an example of trying something new, and we're all here to see how well it works. So this was an effort.
Is this the LaSalle Street Reimagined? So we're on the same
LaSalle
page.
Street Reimagined, where we're saying we've got a bunch of buildings that had been banks or law firms that are vacant. We know people are interested in redeveloping them. We also know that we have a pretty rich TIF in this area, and people could sure use the help. So let's try an experiment here that says we've got TIF, we've got the statewide tax abatement that I mentioned, we've got historic tax credits, we've got 4% credits, we've got all kinds of things that the city could throw at this to help reach a higher threshold of 30% affordable units. And I do think it's important to note, the ARO requires 20% without any public money. This would be 30% with public money to try to reach that. And so I think, we're in the phase of, we will see what we get back, and we're excited to see how well that goes. But I think it's important to note at this point through the ARO, we have 2 completed ARO units in the central business district. So if the goal we had on this was 1,000 units overall, so 300 of them being affordable, that would be a 14,900% increase in affordable units in the CBD, which would be pretty cool.
There's a lot going on. And we can link to this in the show notes, but if you haven't heard of the LaSalle Street Reimagined, there's a few webinars on it. There's it's its own dedicated webpage with a ton of information, but it's a massive undertaking.
It is. And it was, predated by a whole study that was, managed by the planning department and so on. So it is well-informed effort.
Very cool. I want to ask about tiny homes as well. So we've had Sonia Del Rio on the show, and she was absolutely excellent. And I know that's one of the other, call it gun in the chamber to kind of tackle affordability. Do you see more of these type of developments happening? Is that something that you guys are getting behind and excited about?
Yes, we announced, the mayor announced in her budget address that we would be issuing an RFP in the second quarter of next year for, we think, 2 to 3 tiny home communities, right? So this is a step. It's not a cure-all, just as ADUs aren't a cure-all, just as most things we do, are like one tool in a big toolbox. But I like this because it really gets at what are the different ways that people form communities, and what are the different means by which we can create homes for people that don't all have to fit in, in the same box. So when we have city-owned vacant land, a lot of times what we do is facilitate someone building a single family home on it, right? Which is fine and good. We do affordable home ownership. We do market rate ownership on lots all the time. But what if there were a slightly more dense version of something to do on a random single lot or maybe a double lot that got us the ability to create a community in a different way, right? Maybe this might be homes for income restricted artists, and the communal space is one where they work on their art and store their supplies, right? Or a group that wants to create a limited equity cooperative, and they do so in this way. Another thing is that there are people whose mental health would improve if they had their own front door and their own outdoor space, and they did not have to navigate shared spaces like hallways and elevators. And the way that people typically access their own front door and their own green space is prohibitively expensive, right? You have to be able to afford a single family home with it in order to do that. So are there ways we could improve people's mental health just through the design of some low density housing in this way? I think those are super interesting questions for us to be exploring. I think we should be exploring them. So what I like about this is we'll put out a call and say, hey, we want to help financially make this possible. Tell us your ideas. It could be that, for a range of uses, but we want to see what's out there, what people care about, what they want to do, and we'll go from there.
You mentioned the vacant lots, and I saw on Cranes today, the city's releasing thousands of more houses that are lots that they own right now for various uses for neighbors or developers. Is there any requirements specifically tied to those that you want to talk about or share with us?
Well, what I'd like to emphasize there is just how groundbreaking and important this is, because the city owns 10,000 vacant lots, which is just a mind-boggling number. And prior to the issuance of this bond, the Chicago Recovery Plan bond, the problem was we did not know which of that land was clean, which was dirty, which was somewhere in between, et cetera. And so it was a very cumbersome process for people to work with the city and get far along in the process, only then to have it tested and find out, oh, wait, this is prohibitively expensive to clean this land. So what the bond was able to do is the Department of Planning and the mayor's office worked together to basically green light a whole bunch of lots to say, these we already know are clean and ready to go. So these are the ones we are prioritizing. They've gotten appraisal already, and now they're listed on our website as good to go. And that way we do not waste people's time. We have a one-stop shop kind of portal to apply for them. There's a number of uses. It could be for housing, could be for a side yard, it could be for economic development. But we really did the work. We finally had the resources to do the work to make this a good use of people's time and investment to approach us for the land.
It's great. We'll put the link on the website. I actually applied. I saw it come through today and I applied or put, I'm interested in a particular lot next to another one of my lots already today. So
Oh, great.
There you go. Mark, we've covered a lot. Anything else? Are we good to wrap?
let's wrap.
Let's do it.
All right. All right, Commissioner, you ready here? So
I'm ready.
what is your competitive advantage? How have you been able
gosh, I forgot you had questions for me.
It's even better.
It's live. Let's hear it.
Oh, no.
All right. What has been your competitive advantage? How have you been able to reach this level of achievement?
Oh, goodness. So I will say that I had the advantage of being a project manager of affordable housing from a pretty young age professionally. And I think that helped me get comfortable very early on with directing people who have more expertise than I do on a particular thing. I think sometimes we can get intimidated and say, well, if I don't know how to do everything, then I couldn't possibly manage this whole thing. And that's really limiting. It's a limiting belief that says I have to be an expert in everything, which no one's an expert in everything. So the ability, what I learned through that process early on was it's my job to see the whole picture And it's my job to bring in folks who have a very deep but pretty narrow expertise. And together I march us all toward a goal. And I can be humble enough to say, I don't know what you know, so please inform this step because I need your expertise. But here's my expertise. I'm seeing the big picture and I need you to work faster, or I need this, or I need that. That was a really important learning skill for me in a formative age that I think a lot of people maybe don't get till later or turn down offers because they're intimidated if they feel like they don't know enough.
This is where I get to plug one of my favorite books.
Who, Not How.
Dan Sullivan, Who, Not How. It's all about knowing the who and not the how.
Okay, I'm writing that down. Thank you. I'm coming away with something.
Yeah.
So you've also been on the investment and developer side of things. What is the one piece of advice you would tell someone that is yet to buy their first property here in Chicago?
So similar, I mentioned in my last response, humility. I think have a good understanding of what you have the ability to bite off. Sometimes a big part of what I think our team spends time on is saying, hey, I think that you applying for our New Homes for Chicago, our City Lots for Working Families program requires that you take on 8 lots at a time and build 8 homes. If this is the very first time that we're even talking to you about this, I don't think 8 lots is probably where you need to be, right? I think let's maybe have a conversation with the land bank about acquiring a single lot, or now you can visit our website and see about acquiring a single lot from us and work through that. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just let's get your feet under you, right? And so I think that's one thing I would say is let's all have the self-reflection to say, what am I ready for? What can I learn? Have enough bandwidth to make a few mistakes, but not crash and burn.
All right. Don't bite off more than you can chew. I love it. All right, here's an easy one. What do you do for fun?
So nothing, nowhere near enough do I do for fun. That's a goal of mine in the future is developing more things that I do for fun. So my kids are just starting to get to an age where I have more time. And so this is a goal of mine. I was just talking to my husband about this. One of the things that I do that brings me joy, but I don't do nearly enough, is that I learned to speak Italian in college and beyond. And I've studied in Italy, and my contact with my family in Italy is something that brings me great joy. And I'm hoping to go back in March. So that's something that I do for fun, but that's not really what you meant by that question. So I got to work on that. That's
pretty cool.
No, that's a hobby. We're in Italy. Where are you guys from in Italy?
My family is from a town in Sicily called Trapani, but I lived in Milan when I lived there.
Awesome.
Cool. I was trying to think of something cool to say in Italian, but I can't think of anything to tie it in.
Che peccato.
I know the basics. I'll say how to Verderci at the end of this. All right. What is either a good book, good podcast, or self-development activity? Go ahead and pick one or all those that you'd recommend to our listeners.
So there is a doctor that I follow on Twitter, who's my Twitter BFF, Nicole Lepera, and she has a book coming out called How to Meet Yourself. And she posts things every day. She's a psychologist, just basic things about healthy interactions with people in the world, things like setting boundaries, and how boundaries are really more about yourself and what you're going to do as opposed to what someone else might do. Things that come up a lot in my work life and things like that. And so that's one that I would recommend. I got her book on back order.
Oh, I can only imagine in your position, the boundaries you have to draw up on a daily basis and the parameters, just to keep yourself from getting sucked every which way. I can only imagine.
I would say my biggest growth area since starting this job is managing a healthy level of detachment on all things work.
That's awesome. Well, we appreciate you coming out here today as in your busy schedule. So, all right. Who is one person in your network you'd recommend as a quality resource to a Chicago investor?
I think if someone, you mentioned, Tom, that your average listener is, maybe has a handful of 2 and 3 flats or something along those lines. I think if folks have not yet plugged into the Cook County Land Bank, I think that's an incredibly important resource for all kinds of things. And I think they've really done a good job of trying to meet people at a range of experiences and portfolios and all of that, meet them where they are and help them grow.
I know you looked up the episode number.
I looked it up, episode 38. For those who go back and find them, we had them on here talking about when you can't find deals on the MLS, they have multiple deals out there, both lot and actual single family properties. So, Commissioner Novara, thank you so much. You have provided a ton of value to our listeners. Is there any way they can learn more about you or any way they can provide value to you?
Ooh. Well, I post things about our work as a department on LinkedIn. I do probably less of that on Twitter, but mostly on LinkedIn. I am noting the things we're doing that matter to me and that tie into our vision and our mission. So that certainly is the case. I mean, a way that I think in general, people can provide value to the work that we do is, I will say this, don't be a bystander when there are opportunities to weigh in on affordable housing in your community. Sometimes, and I know this because, I live in Chicago, so I get letters from my alderman saying, hey, this affordable housing development's going up down the street. Come to this meeting about it. Well, we happen to fund the deal, but I'm also live around the corner, so I get the letter, right? And I think it's very easy to get a letter like that and say, oh, sounds good, fine by me. I don't need to go to the meeting. And what the truth is, though, that everyone who thinks that's the worst idea in the world will be there. And if no one else is there to say, hey, I think this is a fine idea. I think all neighborhoods should be contributing to the city's affordable housing needs or what have you, then it makes it much harder for the building to get built. It makes it harder for the elected official to say, sounds like there's a range of viewpoints here. I'll take them all into consideration, et cetera. So I think don't be a bystander when there's opportunities to support things that provide affordability for a range of people across the city.
Love it. Mark, you're about to jump in there.
No, I it's funny. I said on mute. I had it muted. I said, love it. You said it right as I did too. So
after 200 episodes, we're starting to get this down here.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. We end everything with this little Chicago fact here. Mark, who are we playing for?
We're playing for Jimmy Cristofano out of Addison.
All right.
Bought a t-shirt and a sweatshirt. So thank you, Jimmy.
Holiday season, man. Let's get that merch store going.
Yeah.
All right. So so the way this works is Mark gets first shot at it, but then you also get a chance to answer. If we get it right, Jimmy will get his gift card from us.
Yep. $50 gift card brought to you by Renovo Financial.
All right. So Mark, I pity the fool who doesn't get this one. Mr. T, one of the many famous folks born and raised in Chicago. He attended Dunbar, which I did not know. Which CHA housing project did Mr. T grow up in? And would you like multiple choice on this?
Yeah, please, because I'm gonna.
Right. I know you don't know this, but you got a 1-4 shot.
I think he lives in Evanston now, though. I didn't. I thought you were going there with it.
Cabrini Green, Ida B. Wells, Robert Taylor Homes, or Altgeld Gardens. I'll give you a big clue. If you just play by the numbers, you'll get it.
Oh, Altgeld Gardens.
No. Robert
really?
Taylor.
Robert Taylor.
Why would I don't get the clue?
Yeah, but
wasn't Robert Taylor the biggest of all 4 of those, or is Altgeld bigger?
Altgeld's bigger.
Oh, Robert Taylor is bigger.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, Robert Taylor is bigger.
Oh.
I threw you off the scent. I'm sorry, Mark.
Well, maybe Altgeld Gardens is one of the biggest left, I guess, is what I've probably seen, and not taking into account ones that have been taken down. Okay. Oh man,
Robert Taylor was like 4,000 units or something crazy.
Yeah, I knew it was, but that property down there, 127, is huge too. So
I misled him. Give Jimmy his gift card. That's on us.
All right. It's Renovo's money.
That's on us.
Money. So
Justice for Jimmy.
Yeah.
Yep. Commissioner Novara said we had to, so we're
That's
good.
right.
So, all right. Commissioner, thank you very much for being on here. Tom, thank you very much. Listeners, we're going to link to all this. There's a lot of stuff we're going to link to in this episode, but we're also going to get into the ADU and the pilot program and revisit some of that. We're going to link to some of the different blogs and breakdowns we have of that on our website, along with the previous episodes we've had. So check that out. If you have any questions for us, you can connect us, ask Tom or Mark on the website, straightupchicagoinvestor.com. Thank you, Commissioner. And thank you, Tom. Listeners, we'll see you next week.
Thanks all.